Hi, everybody. Welcome to Philosopher Meets Critics. This event is hosted by the University of Cologne and the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil. My name is Paul Silva. I'm a professor of philosophy here at the University of Cologne, and I'm hosting today's event. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to introduce you to Jessie Munton and her new Oxford book, Priority and Prejudice, The Epistemology and Salience of Attention. Jessie Munton's an associate professor of philosophy at Cambridge University. She took her PhD from Yale. And in addition to her book, she's published in leading academic journals such as Noos, PPR, Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society, and other venues. Jessie will have three critics today. The first critic will be Jessica Keiser. She's an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Leeds. She took her PhD from Yale also. She's the author of the book Non-Ideal Foundations of Language with Routledge. And in addition to her book, she's published with PPR and the Journal of Philosophy, Ethics and Social Philosophy, and other philosophical venues. Our next critic will be Richard Pettigrew. He is a professor of philosophy at the University of Bristol. He took his PhD in mathematical logic from Bristol. And he's the author of various books and numerous articles, including Epistemic Risk and the Demands of Rationality, Choosing for Changing Selves, Accuracy and the Laws of Credence, among many other publications. And our final critic is Rachel Fraser. She's a philosopher, essayist, and critic generally. Fraser is an associate professor of philosophy at MIT. She took the DPhil in philosophy from the University of Oxford and is the author of numerous papers in journals such as Mind, PPR, Ethics, Phil Studies, Analysis, and others. So these are our critics, and we'll hear from them after we hear from Jessie, who's going to now summarize her book for us. So Jessie, please take it away, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for this terrific opportunity. I'm excited to talk about the book with my critics today. Um, Sorry, I'm just having trouble moving it forward. Okay. So this book attempts to respond to a core problem, which is understanding and evaluating the role that salience and attention play in our epistemic lives. So I think that salience and attention play a really integral role in them. They determine what kinds of inquiries we undertake, how we go about gathering evidence, which evidence we attend to and form our beliefs around, and which we neglect. And then also at the other end of what I think of as the belief formation pipeline, what we do with the beliefs that we form, so which we perseverate on, which we use to act on the basis of, and which we perhaps neglect or forget. But it isn't clear how we evaluate salience and attention from an epistemic perspective. And so, what this book aims to do is to give us a framework that allows us to do just that. So, this is what I think of as our belief formation pipeline. Currently, lots of work in epistemology just tends to focus on the middle of it, the point at which we're perhaps weighing and prioritizing evidence and then forming a belief on the basis of it. And I want us to develop a set of resources that help us say a bit more about these early stages where we're selecting projects of inquiry before we've even begun on the process of gathering evidence, and then we're gathering evidence for them. And also these end stages where we're prioritizing among the information that we now have at our disposal and the belief states that we formed on the basis of it. But to find those kinds of evaluative resources, to capture the role of attention and salience in our epistemic lives, we're going to need to kind of extend the reach of what we currently have to a wider section of the epistemic pipeline. And as part of that, I think that we need ways of evaluating what I think of as negative epistemic space. So that is to say, we don't just want to evaluate the beliefs we do form or the knowledge states we do arrive at, but we also want evaluative resources that let us say something about what we neglect, the things that we remain ignorant of, and the things that we forget. And as part of that, we want resources which can capture the kind of structure that attention imposes on our informational landscape. So I don't think we just want to be able to evaluate one individual occasion on which you attend or fail to attend to something, but we want to think more generally about your attentional dispositions and what's contributing to those and whether they're serving you well from an epistemic perspective or not. So I think of attention as a little bit like the windows in the house. You can think about the quality of the windows themselves, but it matters just as much where you've placed the windows in terms of thinking about if you've got good windows in a house. So the book aims to do three things. It aims to introduce the concept of a salient structure. A salient structure is the object of evaluation that I think we need to say something about attention and salience. I then tried to give us a framework for evaluating salient structures from a distinctively epistemic perspective. So I think salient structures serve many masters and that we can also evaluate them from a practical perspective or from an ethical perspective, but I'll be focusing on the epistemic. And then I use that to shed some light on a range of other domains. So what I'll do in this brief summary is just say a bit more about each of those three things. So first of all, what is a salient structure? Well, to get there, I want to be really clear about what I mean by attention and salience, which are terms that I've already used a lot. And in the book, I have a much more extended discussion of this, but as none of my critics are going to be discussing it today, I'll keep it fairly brief for now. So by attention, I mean the mind's selection of a stimulus for further processing. And in thinking of attention in that way, I'm following Wayne Wu, and behind him, William James. So it's a very minimal understanding of what attention is. It needn't involve a particular mechanism. In fact, it can be supported by lots of mechanisms working together that have the result that the mind selects one stimulus rather than another. I'm going to use this term attendibilia. Attendibilia are just the objects of attention, and they can be internal to the mind or they can be external to the mind. So you can attend obviously to things in your environment, the plants around you, for instance. You can attend to objects, but you can also attend to properties or to events. But attendibilia can also be internal, so you can attend to aspects of your own experience or to mental states that you've already formed, for instance. And then my understanding of salience is just very closely tied to attention. So by how salient something is, I just mean how likely it is to be the object of someone's attention. So if we look at this display of dots right here, this red dot is much more likely to grab your attention. You're more disposed to attend to it. So in that sense, the red dot is more salient than the black dots. But salience is determined by lots of factors working together. So some of those are bottom-up factors. So our visual system and our other sensory systems work in particular ways. So high contrast is likely to capture your attention, or moving things are likely to capture your attention. But what is salient to you also depends on top-down factors. So if you have a particular task, for instance, to count each of the dots individually, then that's going to change how you attend to that set of dots. And also your long-standing interests shape what jumps out to you as salient or not. So then how do we put that together to understand what a salient structure is? So what I want a salient structure to do is to capture the very rich set of dispositions that you have to attend to your environment right now. So there's uncountably many things that you could attend to at any given moment. But some of those you're much more likely to attend to than others, and that's what we want a salient structure to describe. So the way I think of a salient structure is that it's a centered set of accessibility relations that's constituted by the subject's dispositions to attend to a set of attendibilia. And so as those dispositions change, then the salient structure changes with it. So we could represent this very simply as a kind of directed graph. So each of these nodes, A, B, and C, represents an attendibilium. It's something that you could attend to. And then these edges that link up those objects represent the likelihood that you would shift your attention from A to B or to C. A salient structure is centered, so if we were making this a full salient structure, we would describe where you were located within it. And then these numbers are describing those probabilities that you shift your attention in one way or another. So you can see that in this very simple salient structure, B is more likely to grab your attention than A or C. If you're attending to B, you're a bit more likely to keep attending to B than to attend to any of the others. And so in this way, we can think of a salient structure as a directed graph that's made up of a set of attendibilia and a set of weighted edges that reflect the probability that the subject shifts their attention from one attendibilium to another. Now, your salient structure is changing all of the time. So if you imagine, for instance, going to the supermarket, there's many, many things that you could attend to. You could attend to how shiny the floor is. You could attend to the items on the shelves, or to the particular promotions. And in fact, the promotions are deliberately there to shape how you attend and then hopefully to change your behaviour on the basis of that. But as you move through the supermarket, your salient structure is constantly changing just in virtue of the fact that your environment is changing. So as you move from one aisle to another, there's a different set of items that you can easily attend to. And as you leave the supermarket, that's going to change all the time. It's also going to change depending on what you're trying to do. So if you're trying to navigate around another shopper, for instance, or if you need to find the bathroom. And so as your attention shifts over your environment, your salient structure changes constantly. And sometimes we want to distinguish those constant changes from kind of more substantial changes to your underlying attentional dispositions. So you might think that certain life events, like getting a dog, for instance, have a bigger impact on your salient structure than simply moving down the aisle of a supermarket. And we can capture that by drawing a distinction between static and dynamic salient structures. So a static salient structure, like I said, is that directed graph that's made up of that set of attendibelia and weighted edges. A dynamic salient structure, on the other hand, is a function which takes us from your current centered salient structure and the particular tasks you're working on and your context to a new centered salient structure. So it's going to look like this. So for instance, as the particular task you have in the supermarket changes, of course, that's going to change your salient structure. But that doesn't mean that your dynamic salient structure has changed. Your dynamic salient structure only changes when we keep that task exactly the same and find that you're attending to a different set of items, or that the probability that you would attend to them has changed. Okay, so with that brief sketch in hand, I'm going to turn now to the second thing the book tries to achieve, which is to give us a way of evaluating salient structures. So how should we evaluate these things from an epistemic perspective in particular? What should you attend to, epistemically speaking? Well, I think we should start from thinking about what we want from a salient structure. So, as I think is probably clear from my little diagrams of directed graphs, I'm thinking of a salient structure as a kind of network. And it's a network which regulates our access to a particular good. And in this case, the relevant good is information. So, as your attentional dispositions change, how accessible information is to you is changing all of the time. So one thing we want from a salient structure is that we just want access to that good, which in this case is relevant information. What do I mean by relevant information? I'll say more about this in a moment, but the basic framework I'm working with is that we want information that is relevant to a particular question. And that question arises from a task that you have. Generally, that's, well, I'm going to think of those in terms of epistemic tasks, which are projects of inquiry of some kind or other. So that very simply gets us to something like this epistemic norm of attention. A subject S should attend to A if and only if A encodes information that is relevant to an epistemic task that S is or should be engaged in. So we can evaluate a salient structure relative to one particular epistemic task, and we can ask, does it give you relevant information for that task? But we need our salient structures to help us out when we're performing a wide range of different tasks. And so the second thing that we want from a salient structure is that we want flexibility. We want it to be capable of allowing us to adapt to changing situations and demands on us. So you could think of this as a little bit like a transport network, like the tube. So on the one hand, you want the tube to get you efficiently from A to B, but you don't just want it to do that for one particular journey. You want it to be capable of changing flexibly to allow you to do lots of different journeys. And so that's where we want flexibility to come in. So I've used this notion of an epistemic task. What is an epistemic task? Very broadly, it's an inquiry. And I conceive of inquiry as aiming at the resolution of uncertainty. Now, an epistemic task can be instigated by a practical or an ethical task. So suppose that you're making a cup of tea. That's a practical task of some kind, but it's going to bring with it various little projects of inquiry that you need to resolve in order to execute it. So you need to know where the tea bags are and if you've got any milk left. And so you can have epistemic tasks that you undertake for practical or ethical reasons. Also, you can sometimes have epistemic tasks that you undertake just because you want to come to know, learn more things. So for instance, reading a book might be something that you undertake just because you want to improve your epistemic position primarily. And then there's going to be this very complex process of weighing those tasks against each other and deciding which of them have priority. And there's going to be a whole set of norms on which tasks you should undertake or prioritize, some of which fall outside the scope of what I'm doing because they're going to require us to arrive at big conclusions about how we weight epistemic and moral and practical norms against one another. Okay, so where does that get us to in terms of finding some epistemic norms for salient structures? So on the one hand, like I said, we want relevance. An epistemically optimal salient structure is one whose constitutive dispositions to attend facilitate access to maximally epistemic task relevant information. But we also want flexibility. And so that gets us to what I call the norm of flexible relevance. An epistemically optimal salient structure is one whose constitutive dispositions to attend facilitate access to maximally task relevant information across a maximally wide range of epistemic tasks. But there's a kind of caveat in there, which is that we rarely want full flexibility. We rarely want you to be able to do this for any possible task that comes your way. Generally, we want to weight that by the probability that you would, in fact, wish to perform a particular task, or that would be something that was important for you from an objective perspective. Okay, so I'm going to move now into kind of fleshing out this picture by saying a little bit about what it lets us say about a range of phenomena that I'm concerned to better understand. So one of these is ignorance, and in the book I have a chapter that discusses what I call the permissibility problem for ignorance, which is why is ignorance sometimes epistemically criticizable and other times it's just fine. So there's a ton of stuff that you're never going to come to know, and that's okay. But on other occasions, there's things that we criticize you for not knowing. And I survey a range of different answers to that and criticize them. But my answer is that ignorance is epistemically criticizable when it is resilient, which is to say that even when you're exposed to the evidence, even when it's evidence that we think is important for you in some way, you are not disposed to kind of acquire or learn from that the relevant information. And so I want to say that resilient ignorance is often underwritten by salient structures that violate the norm of flexible relevance. So they have a kind of rigidity in them, for instance, which means that even when information is task relevant, you're not able to display the relevant flexibility that would let you attend to it in a particular way. Or it might be, for instance, that you are systematically neglecting particular inquiries because of a lack of flexibility in your salient structure, which is focused in such a way that those things aren't likely to be things that capture your attention. And so as a result of that, the subject fails to attend to task relevant information. So that's ignorance in a nutshell. What about inquiry? So I'll say a little bit more about this because it's going to come up in some of the discussion with the critics in a moment. So one of the questions I take up in the book is, are there epistemic norms on what inquiries we should undertake? So there's been a lot of discussion of epistemic norms on when it's permissible to inquire, and on how we should inquire. But epistemologists have in general been, I think, cagier about endorsing the idea that you might have epistemic reason to undertake one inquiry rather than another. And I think that these norms are in place, and in fact that there are some kind of thin constitutive norms on what inquiries you should undertake that are kind of analogous to norms on what beliefs you should form. But also I think there are these kinds of thicker norms on what inquiry you should undertake in the sense of expending energy into undertaking those particular inquiries. So I'll say a bit more about those thick norms and how we get to them. So I endorse this claim, which is that the epistemic reasons an agent has to undertake a particular inquiry vary in proportion to the epistemic value that the agent would be likely to realise by undertaking that inquiry. So I think of inquiry as a goal-oriented activity. I think it's oriented towards realising epistemic value. And then I also make a substantive claim about how we should understand epistemic value in terms of the resolution of uncertainty. And that gets me to this norm: what epistemic for inquiry, you should undertake those inquiries which are most likely to resolve maximum uncertainty. I think salient structures, beyond just getting us to this norm, have a bigger role to play in inquiry. So one thing that salience does is it renders the inquiry space tractable. So we're familiar with the idea that we face an overwhelm of information at any given time, and we need that to be kind of organised for us by a range of factors which result in this kind of salient structure. But we also face an overwhelming quantity of uncertainty at any given moment. So we could undertake inquiries into loads and loads of different things. We're never going to be done learning as finite creatures. And so one thing that salient structures also do for us is that they render some questions more salient to us. So they structure the space of possible questions as well as the space of possible answers. And so they play a role in which inquiries we select. And thinking in terms of salience can help us understand why that sometimes goes wrong. So one of the examples I use in the book is a case where a child, who was called Child Q in the investigation, was strip searched at school. So I think she was a 14-year-old girl, and actually I think the two police officers involved were sacked in the summer of this year after an investigation. So they performed the strip search because they were looking for cannabis. And so there was an inquiry which was uppermost in their mind, which was, is there cannabis on this child? But then there's a whole set of inquiries which they didn't undertake into the welfare of the child or the responsible way of carrying that out. And the inquiry into what happened found that race was a determining factor here. So you might think that part of what's going on is that one of the ways in which the salient structure is organised is around race in some ways, and then that's playing a role in making some inquiries more salient than others, and those are undertaken to the expense of others. Salience also plays a role in the conduct of our inquiries. So once you've kind of started off with one question, it's then important that relevant sub-questions become salient to you from that. And we want to avoid, on the one hand, a kind of excessive topic focus that means that you fail to investigate as broadly as you should. And on the other hand, we need to manage distraction so that we aren't constantly pulled away from effective ways of realizing epistemic value. Okay, good. And so this is where that gets us to the idea that an epistemically optimal salient structure, one that facilitates attention to a maximally task relevant information across a maximally wide range of tasks, will facilitate adherence to epistemic norms of inquiry. So the idea is we've got a kind of mesh here between what makes for a good salient structure and what kind of salient structure facilitates inquiry. Okay, so the last two things I'll say a bit about are prejudice and search engines. So some of my work on salient structures came out of thinking about prejudice in terms of salience and the idea that attentional dispositions can be at least partially constitutive of certain forms of prejudice. So sometimes to understand what prejudice is, we need to think beyond whether somebody has a negative affective attitude or a prejudicial set of beliefs, but also to think about what information is salient to them. And what information is not salient to them. And so part of the project of understanding ignorance as well is really relevant here in terms of understanding prejudicial forms of ignorance, whereby what you know might come to be organised around racial categories, for instance. So I claim that salient structures that are disproportionately organised around demographic categories, they're prejudicial salient structures, and I claim that they're going to be epistemically suboptimal. So the idea is that when you have a kind of demographic category like race or gender that kind of comes in as an organising force on a salient structure, then it becomes harder for subjects to access task-relevant information. So there's various ways in which that can happen. It might be that you have particular explicitly prejudiced beliefs and lots of your attentional patterns are kind of rooted through them, so you're very likely to attend to those. It could be that you have beliefs about race or gender which don't have explicit prejudicial content in them, but they nonetheless come to play this kind of organising role in your informational landscape, so that you attend to them a lot, you attend to them disproportionately, or it might be that we find other kinds of patterning in your attentional dispositions that we can understand when we bring in race or gender as an explanatory element there, even though they don't necessarily have explicit demographic content. But clearly, there are strong pragmatic pressures on us as members of societies that are often very heavily organised around demographic categories to correspondingly arrange our salient structures around them. And so one of the themes that comes out in the book is I think we face a kind of dilemma here between, on the one hand, practical pressures to organise our salient structures in certain ways, and then the epistemic cost that comes at, that it makes it harder for us to learn about our environment and realise epistemic value. This lets us say a few things about prejudice. It gives us a really parsimonious account of implicit bias, because we don't have to posit kind of additional further attitudes beyond implicit bias. We're just looking at patterns of attention. It lets us say some things about the ways in which prejudice is often communicated via the manipulation of salience through jokes, for instance, or questions. And it's also a highly externalist account of prejudice, on which prejudice is stabilised by and resides in forms of social organisation. So it's not just down to the individual whether they're prejudiced. What you attend to depends very heavily on what is in your environment, and that's going to be something that depends on factors that are external to you as an individual. Okay, I'm nearly finished. The final thing I'll say a little bit about is search engines. So there's a kind of natural commonality, I think, thinking about salient structures and search engines, because search engines order information relative to an inquiry. And I think then they can be evaluated along similar lines to salient structures. We want, again, relevant information, and we want it flexibly for a range of different inquiries. But search engines also play this really important role in disambiguating questions. And when they do that, that too alters the accessibility of information. And whilst I think I give us some resources to help us to think about that, I think there are aspects to that that go beyond the merely epistemic. So the accessibility of information through that disambiguation of questions, it alters what we're in a position to know. It alters our understanding of what information matters. And it also shifts the nature of those underlying categories that we're gathering information about. So that's a little sort of snapshot of what I try and do in the book. I think there's lots of questions that are left over from that I hope other people are going to take up. I think there's a lot more to be said about the deprioritization of information. I think there's more to be said about the relationship between affect and emotion and action. So I think about this primarily in informational terms, but I think that salience and attention are heavily influenced by affect and emotion and clearly play a very significant role in determining how we act. And finally, I think there's more to be said about collective or group salient structures and what they might look like.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Jessie. Jessica, would you provide the first set of comments, please?
Thanks so much to the organizers for putting this together, and thanks so much to Jessie for writing this wonderful book. Jessie is a skilled writer. Her style is literary, but also exceptionally clear and funny. She manages to seamlessly blend these qualities together while most professional philosophers struggle to manage even one of them. This makes her writing a joy to read. She also has an eye for interesting topics and a knack for saying insightful things about them. This book is a case in point. It unifies strands of recent interest in epistemology, cognitive science, and social political philosophy to offer an illuminating account of why it's okay to fail to form a true belief about the number of cracks in the wall, and why it's not okay to focus on your colleagues' physical appearance over their ideas. Jessie's account is organized around the notion of a salient structure, which is a set of dispositions to attend. Salient structures are explanatory in that they offer us resources outside of attitudes to explain and evaluate certain phenomena. They also reveal interesting and important ways that attention forms a feedback loop with the kinds of attitudes, both explicit and implicit, that philosophers have historically been more concerned with. In her discussion of salient structures, Jessie draws a distinction between those which are static versus those which are dynamic. She understands a static salient structure to be a centered set of accessibility relations between attendabilia, which are possible objects of attention. Accessibility relations describe a subject's dispositions to switch from one attendabilium to another, where dispositions are understood probabilistically. An individual's static salient structure gives us a snapshot of their attentional dispositions at a particular moment in time. Their static salient structure, of course, might vary dramatically from moment to moment, depending on their environment and what they are doing. So Jessie points out that we might also want a concept of a salient structure that captures something more stable, something that survives changes to tasks and environments. For instance, she points out that if someone is approached by a stranger asking for help while they are in the middle of doing their shopping, they will redirect their attention away from the task momentarily, but there's a sense in which their general attentional dispositions remain unchanged. Similarly, for changes in environment, a person's general attentional dispositions seem to remain stable even when their friend puts their coat on, resulting in that friend's colorful sweater no longer being an accessible object of attention. To get at this more stable sense of our attentional dispositions, Jessie offers the concept of a dynamic salient structure, which is a function from a context, a task, and a static salient structure to another static salient structure. Dynamic salient structures can survive changes to tasks and environments because these variations are, as she puts it, costed in as inputs to those functions. For instance, she points out that a dog owner might attend differently depending on whether they go out with or without the dog, but this does not constitute a change in their dynamic salient structure because the difference comes down to a change in tasks. That is, it's a difference to the input to the function rather than a difference in the function itself. Though dynamic salient structures are more stable than static salient structures, they too can undergo change. Here we can contrast the change in the dog owner's attentional dispositions while going out alone versus accompanied by the dog, with a change in their attentional dispositions before versus after acquiring the dog. While in the former case, the difference came down to a difference in task, the latter case gets at something deeper. It's a change to the broader function that takes tasks and context as input. This is because we see a change in the dog owner's attentional dispositions, even while keeping those inputs fixed. For example, suppose the context is the dog owner's neighborhood and the task is buying a croissant from a cafe. After acquiring the dog, they notice that the cafe has a doggy water bowl outside, whereas previously it would have escaped their attention. I'm going to raise a question about the dynamic salient structures. I'll frame it as a worry because that's how my training in analytic philosophy has taught me to frame things, but I want to note that I'm not particularly worried. I suspect there are many promising avenues of response, so it's more of an invitation for Jessie to say more about some of the details behind the concept of dynamic salient structures and what kind of work she would like this concept to do for us. So here's the worry that's not really a worry. When reading about the dog owner case, it struck me that if we individuated tasks and contexts finely enough, then any change to an individual's attentional dispositions would amount to a change in their static salient structure and not their dynamic salient structure. So consider again the dog owner before versus after acquiring their dog. As Jessie describes the case, we can hold the context, which is the neighborhood, and the task, buying a croissant from a cafe, fixed, and we still see a change in attentional dispositions. Before the dog, they would not have noticed the water ball in this context while performing this task, but after the dog, they do. However, I'm not sure that this is true if we think of either the context or the task or both in a more fine-grained way. To keep things simple, I'll just consider the context. For Jessie, this includes the subject's external environment as well as any aspect of their current state that biases their attention. In the presentation of the example above, we considered context in a coarse-grained way as being constituted by the dog owner's neighborhood. But Jessie's characterization of context, it seems to me, allows for a more fine-grained characterization according to which dog ownership involves a change in context. For instance, after the individual becomes a dog owner, but not before, the context in which they perform the task of buying a croissant includes a dog at their side. Not just any dog, but their dog. Since we are also letting into context internal factors that bias the individual's attention, I would imagine that their affection toward their dog and their beliefs about the responsibilities of dog ownership may also be included. But the more we pack into context, and again, we can do the same thing for tasks, it starts to look like the fact that they attend to the water bowl after becoming a dog owner and not before comes down to a change in the input to the function rather than the function itself. The broader worry is that we can do the same with any other example. Individuate contexts and tasks finely enough, and any change in attentional dispositions can be attributable to changes in context or tasks. This would have the result of making dynamic salient functions too stable. It becomes difficult to see how they could be changed at all. They start to look deterministic. So my question to Jessie is, would you see that as a cost? That is, do you hope the dynamic salient structures could do some theoretical work for us involving, for instance, evaluation or intervention that requires some level of mutability? And if so, do you think there's a principled way to make context and tasks coarse-grained enough to allow for changes in dynamic salient structures? That's my first question to Jessie. My second question will shift gears quite a bit, focusing on the distinction between individual versus social salient structures. It will also be a bit quicker, I think. So far, we've been talking about salient structures, dynamic versus static ones of particular individuals. But Jessie also considers the question of whether there can be social salient structures that are not simply reducible to the salient structures of the members of the relevant group. I gathered here that the answer was yes, but I wasn't sure about the details, so this is an invitation for Jessie to say more about it. Here's one consideration that Jessie presents against the reductionist picture. She rightly points out that intuitively, we will at least sometimes think of the attentional dispositions of a group in a way that does not straightforwardly mirror the attentional dispositions of its members. She gives an example of a football team, or soccer for Americans. A defender and striker will find different things salient in virtue of their respective roles, but we can still talk about what is salient to the team as a whole in a way that is different to the salient structures of the individual members. She then suggests that in order to model this, we can aggregate the salient structures of individuals to produce a salient structure for the group, which, depending on the aggregation rules, may not be identical to the salient structures of the majority of its members, or perhaps any of them. I think this is the right way to go, but it also sounds like a reductionist picture to me. On the aggregate model, the group salient structure is determined by the salient structures of the individual members. Granted, it might not be determined in a way that gives us any sort of overlap between the group structure and the individual structures, but the group structure is derived from the individuals nonetheless. Maybe what's tripping me up here is the use of the word reducible. In some sense, and I won't try to nail it down since I'm not a metaphysician, the group structure seems clearly reducible to the individual structures. However, I also see a sense in which it's not, which concerns explanation. Methodological individualists claim that social phenomena can be explained by reference to what's happening at the individual level, and that reference to social structures is explanatorily inert. Methodological holists, in contrast, insist that social structures are explanatorily indispensable, even if the social structural facts supervene on individual level facts. One of their primary arguments is that the social structures are multiply realizable. So what you learn when you learn that some social phenomenon was a product of patriarchy is different from what you learn when you learn that it was caused by some particular distribution of individual level facts, like actions or beliefs. You learn that even if that particular distribution of the individual level facts had been different, the phenomenon would have still occurred as long as the social structural facts had been held fixed. This is also something Jessie seems to hint at when defending the explanatory value of individual salient structures. Though they are determined by more basic micro-level facts, those micro-level facts are too complex and disjoint to serve as an explanatory tool. Though she doesn't say this explicitly, perhaps they are also multiply realizable by those micro-level facts. I wonder if she would agree to that, and if she might want to use the same consideration in favor of social salient structures. That is, in whatever sense they might be reducible to individual salient structures, they are not explanatorily reducible because of issues of multiple realizability. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jessica. Jessie, you have maybe about 10 minutes or so to respond.
Great. Okay, super. Thank you so much, Jessica, for those comments, which I think dig into two really interesting aspects of salient structures. So I'll say a little bit less about the first and a little bit more about the second. So on this question about dynamic and static salient structures, so I've described dynamic salient structures in the following way: as a function that take in your current static salient structure, your location, and a task and a context, and then you output a new salient structure from that. The reason I want this notion of a dynamic salient structure is because we want to be able to say when a change is kind of deeper or more significant to a salient structure than simply changes to static salient structures, which, as I've said, are happening all the time. But then the challenge that Jessica is raising is, how do we decide when a dynamic salient structure has changed? Well, what you need to do is you need to hold fixed the inputs, and then you see if the outputs change. But the worry is then that whether or not we have a change in task or context just depends on how finely we individuate these things. So if you individuate them very crudely, then you can hold these fixed and get a change the dynamic salient structure insofar as you're getting out a different salient, new static salient structure quite easily. Whereas if what we do instead is we say, well, actually, when you go to the supermarket with your dog, you've got like a different task depending on, for instance, the breed of the dog, then it's going to be much harder to find that what we've got is a change to the dynamic salient structure. Partly, I think that's a really good question to raise because there's a thing I can't say here. I don't want these salient structures, these dispositions to attend, to just be grounded in kind of a set of mental facts about the individual, such that we could identify changes to dynamic salient structure with changes to the kind of individual's mental makeup. Because as Jessica rightly identifies, they're kind of emergent from this very rich set of other underlying facts. And so that makes it slightly trickier for me to answer this question. So I've had exactly the same thought. And I think Jessica is thinking of it primarily in terms of, well, how do you individuate contexts? I've thought about it a bit more in terms of how do you individuate tasks? But I think the key thing here is what do we need dynamic salient structures for? And I think they are to help us describe more significant alterations in someone's attentional dispositions. So for instance, I'm thinking that suppose you have some kind of an intervention to try to reduce prejudice in some way or another. You want then to be able to assess whether that's made any difference. And what you don't want to look at is whether they've just got a different static salient structure because that changes so readily. Instead, you want to be looking at that more dynamic element. But I think that in general, when we have a particular task that we're trying to assess relative to, that's going to help us fix the appropriate fineness of grain. So in particular, for instance, if you are trying to compare how somebody's performance of a particular task has changed, then you want to make sure that you're holding the fineness of grain fixed in your comparison as far as possible, and also that you're excluding the key variable that has changed from your description of the task or the context. So, for instance, if we're assessing how effective a particular intervention on prejudice has been, you don't want to factor in the description that there's been this intervention on prejudice into your description of the task or the context, or you're never going to be able to find that you've got any change to it because instead you've just got to change to the input. So my hope is that, yes, I think you're basically right about that kind of structure there, unless, and I should say this, unless you got down to the very, very finest of grain, and then I don't think that the same question arises. But that I don't think it's that significant because I think that the particular purpose to which you're kind of using the notion of a dynamic salient structure is going to help you pin down how you should fix that fineness of grain. Okay. The second question that Jessica raises is this one. Can there be social salient structures that are not simply reducible to salient structures of the members of the relevant group? I think this is a great question, and I'm really sympathetic to what Jessica was saying about kind of multiple realizability, and I think that's a good way of thinking about it. I also want to mention kind of 4 ways that you might try and go social with salient structures. I've partly been thinking about these recently in the context of thinking about forgetting and what collective forgetting might look like, and if we can capture that in terms of salient structures. And I think each of these ways kind of allows for more or less independence between thinking about what is salient to an individual who comprises a member of a group and what's salient to the group. So kind of the simplest option would just be that you take your individual salient structures that are of a group and you aggregate them to arrive at a representation of the group's salient structures. In that case, you really don't have very much independence at all between the group level and the individual level. You just get the group stuff straightforwardly out of the individual stuff. But then here are some ways of tweaking that so we get a bit more independence. So one thing you could do is you could include only some of the information about the individual salient structures. So in particular, you might think, well, look, it doesn't really matter for social purposes that you have some minority disposition to attend to A. All that really matters is that you're most likely to attend to B. Or you might think the only thing that matters is not what you're likely to attend to for social purposes, but what you do in fact attend to. And so as soon as we do something like that, you have a kind of information loss, which allows for more interesting degrees of separation between what's happening with individuals and what's happening at the level of the group to which they're a member. It's a bit like a first past the post voting system, insofar as because you've got that information dropping out, for instance, it's going to turn out that at the group level, B is super, super salient and A and C are not relevant at all if you have lots of people who have this particular salient structure. So it's not going to reflect the fact that A and C could have been objects of attention. I think options 3 and 4 are more interesting than either of those and probably more successful for capturing the kind of phenomena that we actually want to talk about in terms of collective or group salient structures. So you could think, look, I don't actually think that individual attentional dispositions are that relevant to what is salient to a group. Instead, we need to look for analogues of salience and attention that might come apart quite radically from what salience and attention at the level of individual members of the group look like. So then we need to think about things like what is group attention or what is collective working memory. So you might think, for instance, that the analog of working memory at the level of the collective is when you have some kind of broadcast. So when you have stuff that's on either traditional media or social media, when you have things that are on school curricula, you could think, for instance, of the movement to topple various statues as a kind of group attempt to manipulate what is present in this kind of space of collective working memory. I think there is loads of really interesting work to be done in terms of figuring out those concepts and what they actually look like. And then the last option I want to consider here is thinking about what has kind of causal explanatory priority rather than looking for sort of constitutive independence per se. So, for instance, I think there's lots of ways in which the group actually has priority over individual salient structures. So I think rather than those kind of first two ways I was thinking about it, well, you start with the individual as primary and then you kind of add them up to get to something more collective. Instead, we should be thinking about the ways in which facts about group behavior, about kind of collective social norms, social institutions, those all play this huge role in fixing facts about individual salience in the way that I think Jessica's alluding to. And so then the individual salient structure might be best understood as actually just a kind of local manifestation of a phenomenon that may be primarily social. I think implicit biases are a really interesting potential example of this, that actually they're highly contextually variable at the level of the individual, but they're much more steady and stable at the level of like the postcode or the group. And so you might think then that the reason why you're seeing that variability is because implicit bias is actually a phenomenon that needs to be understood primarily at that group or collective level, rather than being best analysed as something that is kind of located within an individual. That's all.
Great. Okay. As Jessica said, this was a fantastic book to read and to engage with, partly because it's so well written, but partly just because it's such a rich book. There's just so much going on in it that's so interesting. And I'm sort of in a funny position because in some ways I agree entirely with the question that Jessie's asking in the book. I agree with the approach that she takes. In fact, lots of the sort of individual components of that, and also largely agree with the conclusion. So it's a sort of odd position to be in from the point of view of giving comments. So I thought I would just start off with saying a little bit more. I mean, Jessie already did this a little bit in her overview of things, a little bit more about the kind of context of this with respect to analytic epistemology and its kind of move in the last 10 years towards inquiry and some topics that it hasn't traditionally discussed. And then I've got sort of three comments, two of them reasonably small. Third one is not really any sort of objection, but just a kind of worry I've had about a lot of the stuff to do with epistemic value, which Jessie kind of draws on over the last few years. And so just a sort of request if anybody has some tools for answering the sort of question that I'm interested in. So as Jessie was mentioning, there's been a sort so in analytic epistemology that sort of sits outside of philosophy of science, there's been this sort of focus really on what happens after you've got your evidence. So, well, and actually, that was how I was going to put it in the comments, but Jessie sort of pointed out that that's not entirely true because it's actually really a middle portion of a pipeline that all the focus has been on. It's kind of what happens immediately after you have your evidence, and the question really how you respond to that by forming beliefs. But then there are kind of questions afterwards about whether you retain those beliefs, whether you focus on them and reason from them, and so on. But also there's been this kind of ignoring of the what happens before you get the evidence, and in particular what you might do to acquire that evidence, what you might do to attend to certain things which would give you evidence, and so on. And so there's been a sort of move over the last 10, I suppose, 15 years. In fact, you can trace back a little further to look at sort of that portion of the pipeline that occurs before you have your evidence and indeed determines how you get your evidence. So some of the players involved there, not so much the cat, although the cat is inquisitive and so relevant to this. So there's been this sort of move towards the epistemology of inquiry in the part of analytic epistemology that sits outside philosophy of science. And as Jessie notes in the book, this is not something that's sort of been ignored within the philosophy of science itself. Not too surprisingly, because of course science is largely about inquiry, and so the epistemology of science done within the philosophy of science is often about the epistemology of inquiry. How do you choose which experiments to do, and so on. And that literature, in fact, goes back almost 100 years. The sort of early paper in this is Janina Hosiassen's paper that sort of gives rise to this so-called value of information theorem, which tells you roughly that you shouldn't give up free evidence. Hosiassen's working in a pragmatic framework, and so is David Blackwell, the economist, who kind of comes along about 15 years later and gives this much more general result about this in a slightly different sort of framework. So this question hasn't so much been sort of ignored in the philosophy of science. And I should say as well as that sort of, if you like, formal work about value of information and how you choose between experiments. There's been a lot of sort of detailed non-formal work about how scientists choose experiments, the sociology of this, but also the kind of particular details about experimentation done by some of these people. So the reason for bringing this up isn't just to kind of note that there's this kind of sits in this kind of larger context, but because I think what's interesting about the recent interest in philosophy of epistemology of inquiry within analytic epistemology outside the philosophy of science is that it shows how much richer this topic is really than is evident from the philosophy of science engagement with it, because there are certain kind of peculiar features of scientific investigation which are different from everyday inquiry, and as a result, the philosophers of science working on this sort of epistemology of inquiry don't end up looking at all of these features of everyday inquiry, including, for instance, the sort of questions about attention and salience that Jessie's interested in, but also the questions that she was talking about when she was talking about this pipeline concerning things like memory and deciding which beliefs, once you form them, sort of pick up and do further work with. So that's some of the ways in which this new kind of analytic epistemology of inquiry really goes a long way beyond the work done in philosophy of science. So just kind of to hammer this home, just to highlight some of the differences between these, because they're sort of going to lead on to the comments that I have about Jessie's project. So in scientific inquiry, of course, or at least, I mean, I should say this is really scientific inquiry, at least as it's been modeled in a lot of philosophy of science. And some of the people I was mentioning on the previous slide, who work sort of more in the detailed investigations about particular experimentation in particular parts of science, they've sort of realized that some of the work done on the formal side has missed out some important features in its modeling. But at least as scientific inquiry is modeled in a lot of the epistemology of science, the inquiries that you undertake are sort of very consciously, intentionally planned in advance. They're designed to answer a very specific question that you're explicit about. Maybe you're trying to choose between a range of hypotheses. You're trying to understand a particular causal mechanism or something like that. And then the possible answers to that question are sort of fully understood in advance. So that's a very peculiar sort of feature of scientific inquiry, and everyday inquiry is typically not like this. It's just a lot messier. For one thing, it's not consciously and intentionally planned in advance very often. For instance, it's very often driven by subpersonal processes rather than any sort of explicit or intentional action. It's often, and this is sort of a comment I'm going to make where I think some of my thinking's intention with Jessie's is often not directed at a specific question that you're trying to answer. So you're not kind of undertaking one of these epistemic tasks that Jessie was talking about earlier. And then this final thing, the final feature is that some of our everyday inquiry, and I want to say some of the ways that our attention gets directed, can teach us concepts or different ways of thinking as well as facts, where really in scientific inquiry, what we're looking for it to do is teach us facts. Okay, so Jessie's already, I think, at least quoted at least one of these two, but these are sort of two quotes that sort of give some sense of how Jessie would like to evaluate something like inquiry or our attempts to kind of fulfill these epistemic tasks that she's interested in, and how we would analyze the salient structures that Jessica was kind of talking about more. So here's just a couple of quotes. So reasons for inquiry. The epistemic reasons an agent has to undertake a particular inquiry vary in proportion to the epistemic value that the agent would be likely to realize by undertaking that inquiry. First one, and then relevance. An epistemically optimal salient structure is one whose constitutive dispositions to attend facilitate access to maximally epistemic task relevant information. So a couple of features of these. The first one is to say that it's in both cases the evaluation that you're interested in, either evaluation of an inquiry or evaluation of a salient structure, are relativized to particular tasks. Okay, relativized to the particular inquiry that you're engaged in the case of the first one, and relativized to these particular tasks, epistemic tasks, which are roughly inquiries in the second one. Okay, so the question, so I mean, sorry, that's the first thing to note about these quotes. The second thing is that it's a sort of what Salim Berker calls something like a teleological approach to evaluating inquiry. You think of inquiry as having a particular goal, and you evaluate it by how well it fulfills that goal. Where the goal here is something like giving rise to states that have epistemic value or realizing epistemic value. Okay, so here's a couple of comments. So I'm going to make 3 comments over for the rest of the time. So the first one is, should we really relativize the epistemic goal to zetetic tasks or epistemic tasks, tasks of inquiry? I want to suggest that we shouldn't. Second one is, what exactly is the thing that realizes epistemic value? Jessie wants to say, and I haven't quoted here actually, but wants to say that it's resolving uncertainty. And I want to say that it's actually resolving uncertainty in a specific way, which actually ends up meaning that it's having accurate or correct beliefs or credences or what have you. And then finally, and this is the one that I really just don't have an answer to. This isn't an objection, because I think that there's some better answer than the one that Jessie gives. I simply don't know how we should answer this question, is, can we accommodate in this notion of epistemic value not just how well you kind of represent the world, but how richly you represent it? I'll say more about what I mean by that in a second. Okay, so here's the first comment. Why should we relativize our evaluation of a salient structure or an inquiry that someone's undertaking to a particular question? So this is certainly a feature of scientific inquiry. Typically, and the kind of old formal work by Hosiasen and Blackwell, and then people following that tradition, has very much kind of conceived of it along these lines. You have a kind of range of hypotheses, and your question is just which one is correct. Is this the correct causal mechanism, or is that? Is this the right parameter for this value, or is that? So certainly scientific inquiry does seem to be undertaken relative to a question, and then you can evaluate a particular experiment or piece of scientific inquiry ahead of time by looking at, say, the expected epistemic value of the opinions you would have afterwards, were you to undertake that inquiry, and then update on the evidence you got from it. But it seems like everyday inquiry isn't like that. And quite often, or maybe this is something autobiographical about me and doesn't reflect well on me, but quite often as I'm going about my day, I don't really have any particular epistemic task in mind. My mind's just kind of wandering. I don't have a particular question that I'm trying to answer. This might be happening if I'm kind of just walking down the street and I'm kind of daydreaming. It might be happening if I'm sitting on a train going somewhere and it's too noisy to read anything. Or it might be happening if you're just kind of chatting with a friend. You're not really chatting in order to gain any information, but just sort of shooting the breeze. So in those kind of situations, it doesn't look like there's any sort of specific task involved, but nonetheless, salient structures can still be evaluated in those cases. And you can, in fact, still evaluate them for the effect they have on the epistemic value of your beliefs after this kind of experience. Well, why? Well, you just look at, in fact, the epistemic value of your whole state, not just your opinions about possible answers to the question that you're investigating, because there is no question around, but just and the epistemic value of your whole state, which is the epistemic value of all the beliefs that you had. So that's the first question. Why should we relativize? Wouldn't we get a kind of a more realistic picture of how we evaluate these salient structures if we look look at evaluating them just for their effect on the epistemic value of your whole state rather than just the part of your state that concerns the answers to a question. The second thing is, Jessie, I should say just ahead of this, I'm not entirely clear to what extent there is a disagreement here, but it seemed to me at various points in the book that Jessie suggests that what's epistemically valuable is the resolution of uncertainty. She did use the same phrasing in the précis of the book earlier. But of course, there's a sort of obvious worry about that phrasing, which is that you can resolve uncertainty in the direction of falsehoods just as much as you can resolve it in the direction of truth. I may resolve my uncertainty about whether it's going to rain tomorrow in the direction of it not raining tomorrow, but that might in fact be false, and it doesn't look like I would gain any epistemic value by resolving in that direction. In fact, you might think I lose it. I do worse than I currently do. Now, Jessie has this other way of thinking about epistemic value, which is the epistemic value of your kind of epistemic states, your doxastic states, are measured by something like your proximity to the big knower, or the big understander, the person who has kind of the best possible opinions, whether they're knowledge or understanding or just true belief, about everything. So you want to try to approach this person. But of course, it's true that one of the features of the big knower that you want to try to emulate is that the big knower is certain about things. But you wouldn't want to emulate her if she was certain about false things. You want to emulate her because she's certain about true things. So is it her correctness, really? So I think when we're thinking about epistemic value, rather than thinking about it just in terms of the resolution of uncertainty, it's the resolution of uncertainty in the direction of truth, which sometimes gets called, say, in the accuracy first literature, just accuracy. Okay, so those are the kind of, in some ways, I think, I mean, there's nothing in anything I've said that threatens anything about Jessie's project. And as I say, I kind of agree with so much of it that I would want to do anything that threatened it. But I think those might be changes that would be interesting to consider. The final one I find a bit of a puzzle. Okay, so here's a difference between me and the big knower. There's two differences between me and the big knower. There's lots of difference, but here are two. One, the big knower knows things that I am merely uncertain about. But there are things that I have an opinion about, but that opinion is uncertainty. But there's this other difference between me and the big knower, namely that the big knower entertains propositions that I cannot even entertain, perhaps because I don't even have the concepts involved. And that's another way in which I'm far from the big knower. And I can get closer to the big knower by being able to entertain more of these propositions. So I can gain new concepts, and by gaining these new concepts, I can thereby be able to formulate and then have opinions about propositions the big knower has an opinion about, and then hopefully resolve my uncertainty about those in the direction of truth. So it looks like there are these kind of two different dimensions along which I'm different from the big knower. There's the propositions that I currently entertain, that the big knower also entertains, but the big knower is doing better at them than I am, because they've resolved their uncertainty in the direction of truth. But there's also these other propositions I don't even entertain, and I would in some sense be doing better if I could. Perhaps not for all propositions that they entertain, but at least for some of them. So you might think of standard sorts of examples about this. So for instance, perhaps I'm trying to put people in a political spectrum, and I've only ever considered the left-right economic dimension of the spectrum and never considered the authoritarian libertarian dimension of it. I then come to acquire that concept of authoritarian libertarian in that dimension. I can now entertain more propositions, and you likely will think that I'm now in a better epistemic position because of my acquisition of those concepts. And then there's other sorts of concepts that say help us understand our social situation. So if you think that understanding is really the kind of source of epistemic good, you probably think that having these concepts and being able to formulate propositions in terms of these are useful. So taking sort of sexual harassment and marital rape from Miranda Fricker's work, the reason we think of, we're kind of taken with Fricker's idea of hermeneutical injustice is exactly because there's something epistemically good about having these concepts that allow us to understand our social situation and lacking them as an injustice for that reason. There's also kind of obviously practical goods about having these, but there's also epistemic ones. And then other ones, gaslighting, racial capitalism, elite capture, the Overton wind. You can think of all sorts of concepts that you might acquire that kind of put you in a better epistemic position. Okay, so you might think, oh, no problem. We just, make epistemic value proximity to the big knower and its proximity along two dimensions, being better at kind of certainty about propositions we already entertain and then gaining an ability to entertain propositions we don't currently entertain. Enter Jennifer Carr, who has this really under-discussed paper, I would say, Epistemic Expansions, from, I guess, 10 years ago now, that shows that if you try to give an account of epistemic value like this, there are going to be problems from population ethics that come up. So in population ethics, you have this problem. There seem to be two dimensions along which we can improve the kind of overall welfare of the universe. How? By improving the lives of people already existing and making more people exist who live happy lives. And the problem of population ethics, the paradoxes of it is it's very, very difficult to come up with measures of the kind of overall welfare of the universe that respects both of those dimensions. And so Carr kind of draws this analogy over to the epistemic case and points out it's also going to be very difficult to come up with a measure of epistemic value that also acknowledges these two different ways in which your epistemic situation can improve, getting more certainty about what you already entertain, being able to entertain further things. I should just mention that Sumaya Tauhidi, there's not an awful lot of more work done on this kind of question about what are the epistemic goods of gaining new concepts, but an advert for Sumaya Tauhidi's recent PhD thesis where she is interested in a kind of interesting different question, or a slightly different question, where she notes that the kind of gaining new concepts also come with a greater cognitive load. And so you have this kind of trade-off. If you want to gain new concepts, yes, that might gain you some epistemic value, but it's also going to increase your cognitive load. But the thing that makes this kind of relevant to Jessie's project is that salient structures seem like something that can allow us to acquire these new concepts. So I can gain new concepts exactly by attending to different parts of the world, and different salient structures will allow me to attend better. So think about some of the concepts that I was talking about in the previous page. Sexual harassment might be a really particularly good one, where there's a lot of, it's very contested whether anything like Fricker's story of how the concept came to be in wide circulation is true. But you certainly can imagine that the way that the concept was acquired was by people attending to particular similar features of predatory behavior that they then brought under the same concept that then allowed them to understand the kind of wrong that was being enacted by this sort of behavior. And it was exactly these, mechanisms of attention that led to that. So it looks like salient structures can also do that. If they do that, then they increase our epistemic value in some way, but it's very difficult to come up with this account of epistemic value. Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay, super. So I feel like this should really say response to Richard Pettigrew's response. I like the kind of iterative structure of these things. Thank you, Richard, for those wonderful comments, and they're much richer than what I'm going to do justice here in what I say in response to them, which inevitably is kind of me responding to them on the terms of the book, whereas I feel like there's a lot more to be said about them more broadly and their broader significance. So the first question that Richard raises for me is why do I need relativization to an epistemic task? So here's where relativization to an epistemic task comes in. I'm saying, look, the good that salient structures mediate our access to is information, but in particular relevant information. And so an epistemically optimal salient structure is one whose constitutive dispositions to attend facilitate access to maximally epistemic task relevant information. But as Richard points out, you could instead think that you could just make do with thinking about the epistemic value of the whole state rather than wanting to relativize it to epistemic tasks. So there's a few reasons why I have done it in that way and why I think relativization to an epistemic task is important. So one reason is it kind of helps us potentially avoid paralysis. It makes it more likely that you are going to have kind of decisively more reason to attend to some things than others. So if you don't have that in play, you might think, right, so what I need to do when I attend is to, let's say, resolve maximum uncertainty, but there's lots and lots of different ways that I could attend that would let me do that. And so to that extent, yes, you could end up with some norms, but they might be quite quiet norms that don't offer very much direction. And I'm not sure that that really reflects our normative practices when it comes to thinking about attention, that we often feel like there is a thing in a given situation that you ought to be attending to. And I suspect that that's because the kind of normative structures we want there are in fact kind of task relative in this particular way. So the idea would be that what then can give you decisive reason to attend in one way rather than another is the fact that you have some particular task in play. I think this also helps us understand why what you should attend to is constantly changing. So why it kind of switches from one quite proximal item to another proximal item. That's because the particular tasks that you're trying to achieve are changing. And so it helps us appreciate the kind of texture and variation we get in this particular normative landscape. I'm not going to say very much about this one for now because it's going to come up more in Rachel's comments. I also think it helps us with the triviality problem, which is why is it more valuable to learn about some things than others? In particular, why is it not very valuable to learn how many blades of grass there are on the lawn or how many freckles there are on the nose of your beloved versus kind of bigger, more substantial bits of knowledge? I think some of that, not all of that, but some of that work is going to be done by this notion of relativization to an epistemic task. That, yeah, sometimes you should attend to the number of blades of grass if you have some reason that you need to be pursuing that particular inquiry. But in the absence of such a reason, it's not going to be as valuable as other information. It also, I think, helps us explain times when it seems like it's permissible, even to be recommended, that you should attend to things that don't actually maximize maximum uncertainty that you could in a particular moment. So, for instance, if you are hurrying to leave a sinking ship and there's an encyclopedia on the shelf, you could learn loads, you could resolve loads of uncertainty by reading the encyclopedia, but for practical reasons, you shouldn't do that. You should get off of the ship. And so we can explain that in terms of this kind of complication to the normative structure that thinking in terms of tasks introduces, that sometimes you're kind of trading off these practical tasks against epistemic tasks, and that changes what you should be attending to. Yes, and then there's going to be a set of norms on which tasks you should prioritize at a given moment. So that's some of the reasons for relativizing to an epistemic task. But I hear this worry that Richard raises that sometimes, you're just standing at the bus stop and you're eavesdropping on the conversation next to you, and that kind of seems like maybe you're doing something valuable in acquiring information. And sometimes that can be really interesting and set you on to other things, and yet you didn't seem to have any relevant task in play. So one way we could deal with this sort of thing is to say that actually you do have certain standing tasks of in particular, I think there's this massive standing task that often gets eclipsed by localized ones, which is just figuring out how things are, how the world is, where you are in the universe. And so almost any information is going to help you with that. But on the other hand, I actually think that sometimes you shouldn't attend to those sorts of things. And I think that thinking about it in terms of tasks is helpful with that. That sometimes you have the opportunity to acquire information, but it's not the information that you should go for, because effective inquiry requires selectivity and a kind of familiar need to balance exploitation and exploration. And so sometimes you shouldn't always be seeking out, or you shouldn't even be acquiring kind of new information that's going to come at the cost of your ability to gain the information that you need to resolve the uncertainty that's relevant to a particular task. So one way you could think about this is you could think, there is value to the information that you're getting from that conversation at the bus stop, but we want to kind of relativize it to the appropriate priority of the task to which it's relevant. And the ways that we would have to describe that task would give it a lower priority than some more proximate ones you might have. On the other hand, if you're literally just standing around at the bus stop, then you probably are going to improve your epistemic position by listening into the conversations around you. Okay. Then there's this question of how different is resolving uncertainty from acquiring true beliefs and knowledge. And I basically agree with Richard that I want to resolve uncertainty towards the true or towards the accurate. But you still might then wonder, well, could you just sort of do what you want to do in terms of true beliefs and knowledge? Why think about it in terms of resolving uncertainty? And certainly, I also think that resolving uncertainty often amounts to or will entail acquiring true beliefs and knowledge. And almost any time you acquire true beliefs and knowledge, you're going to resolve some uncertainty. How much space there is between them is going to substantially depend on your theory of belief and knowledge. And so I think that the way I think about resolving uncertainty is going to be much closer to a kind of probabilistic model of belief as degrees of confidence distributed over a particular probability space, and it would be, if we're conceiving of beliefs as kind of representations that are stored in the mind in some way and that can be individuated in some very substantial way. And so one of the reasons that I want to couch epistemic improvement in terms of the resolution of uncertainty is, again, to try and help us avoid these triviality worries. And again, I'm holding back a bit, and we'll have a fuller discussion of this in response to some of what Rachel will say. But basically, I don't think that the sheer kind of number of beliefs or pieces of knowledge matters. And I'm worried about approaches that think that we can individuate beliefs or not, or knowledge in that way. I want to find a way of thinking about the improvement of your epistemic situation that kind of gets away from thinking about the cardinality of bits of information that you have. But again, like I say, I think that's going to be less of a worry, or there'll be more overlap between how I'm thinking about it and then more sophisticated models of belief states that also avoid that. One other thing I've thought about a bit, and I don't have very settled views on it, is how we should think about the kind of epistemic improvement that can come about through more kind of indirect results of inquiry that don't look like they involve true beliefs or knowledge. So these kinds of less direct forms of epistemic improvement I have in mind are where perhaps you learn something that's strictly false, but it brings you in some sense closer to knowledge, or it enhances your understanding. So I'm thinking of the kinds of things you might get through metaphors or models, like a kind of Popperian verisimilitude. Sometimes I think that will just involve a reduction in uncertainty, but sometimes it won't. And in particular, this may not always involve kind of accurate or true representation. So thinking about, as I understand it, a lot of what they taught us about friction in school is strictly speaking false, but perhaps it gives you a sense of what friction is and how it operates. And so in some sense, it does seem right that your epistemic position has improved, even if you've not gained more accurate beliefs or knowledge along the way. And that's, I wonder if there's ways of thinking about that as resolving some kind of uncertainty in terms of it imposing a kind of structure over your inquiry space, even though it hasn't resulted in the formation of true beliefs. Okay, so Richard finally raised this really interesting question to do with there being two dimensions of epistemic value. And I basically agree with him that I can see these two dimensions in play. And I find that kind of thinking about these two dimensions in terms of salience brings me up against kind of exactly similar tensions, I think, to some of what have come out of the literature on Jennifer Carr's work, and also Sumaya's PhD that Richard referred to. So on the one hand, we've got accuracy of representations, and we've also got richness of representations. And I think Richard was talking a bit about kind of propositions and how many propositions the big knower will know. But I think you also, maybe we don't have to think about this in terms of propositions, but also, as he was alluding to, in terms of kind of conceptual resources that you have at your disposal, for instance. So I suppose the first thing to say here is that I think it's interesting that we can capture some of these forms of richness of representation in kind of network theoretic terms. So if you think of the subject who's learning to draw more fine-grained distinctions, then there's ways of capturing that in how we kind of model their salient structure. So one way you could think about it is just that the sheer number of attendibilia in their network increases. And so in that sense, the size of the network increases. I think the way I tend to think about it is that those attendibilia are in some sense already there, because it's possible they could attend to them. It's just vanishingly unlikely that they will attend to them until they've acquired the requisite structure. And so another way you might think about it is just that the network is becoming more dense in the sense that we're getting more connections between these items. And I think thinking in terms of that density is going to be helpful in a moment to understanding why there might be costs and benefits to this. And so you also it might become denser partly because these kind of nodes are coming into view, and also because you're coming to appreciate that there are new conceptual connections between different items in your network is another thing that can be happening. So there's going to be ways for sure in which then that might be an epistemic good for the subject. So you might in particular gain flexibility. You might also be able to sometimes access more task relevant information. But I think again that there's also going to be some epistemic costs potentially to it. So for a finite subject who's trying to come upon task relevant information, then a larger network isn't always better. And so partly I think this is a really interesting question, because it might mean that there's a kind of tension in some ways between the ways in which I'm thinking about the whole project is kind of oriented around task relevance, that if you think of it in that way, then there might just be ways in which inevitably you don't want a network that's going to work for the big knower. So the big knower in some ways doesn't need salience and attention because she doesn't need to kind of navigate this informational landscape in the same way that we do. But so whether or not it's better to have a bigger network depends very heavily on the structure of the network if you've got kind of finite resources in order to navigate around it. So, for instance, what you've got here is an illustration of a small world network, and small world networks are often quite efficient ways of organizing things. So, a small world network is where you have these kinds of dense clusterings of nodes which are more densely connected, and then you have sparser connections between those little clusters, between those kinds of subnetworks. So you get something like this in a kind of university town where, for instance, maybe there's a really dense social network of people who all work at the hospital, and there's another dense social network of people who have kids at the same school. And then you have sort of some sparser connections between those, but it's really quick to get from any one person to another. So we know a lot of people in common. You only need a few kind of connecting points between these denser areas in order to say, oh, you must know so-and-so who also works at the hospital or who has a kid in the same school. And so if we think about this in terms of letting you access information, then this is a kind of potentially a good structure to have because when you're engaged on a task, you want there to be lots of connections between the bits of information that might be relevant to that task. But we get flexibility insofar as we have these kind of sparser connections that more efficiently take us to other parts of the network. So I wonder if there are any resources in terms of thinking, in terms of network structure that let us distinguish between when, adding a few more nodes in and adding a few more edges in is helpful, and when in fact that's going to actually slow down the ability for the individual to navigate through the network to the information that they want. I think it's also, again, the task relevance stuff comes in here because if you're trying to accomplish a task that requires only coarse grain distinctions, you shouldn't attend to more fine grain distinctions. So the point that Samaya Tahidi's making then about the kind of cognitive load of this stuff, I think comes in there as well. So I'm afraid those are only fairly inconclusive sort of considerations that I'm offering to bear on this problem. But I think, again, it's an issue that's going to pop up in salient structures as well as in the literature that Richard discussed.
Okay, great. Thank you, Paul, so much for organizing this. Thank you, Jessie, for writing a terrific book. And thanks so much to Jessica and Richard for their really thoughtful and interesting comments. My comments will pick up on some similar themes to Richard's. I'm going to be focusing on Jessie's view of inquiry. And I'm going to be floating some objections to the kind of view that Jessie sketches in the book, but that is because, as Quinn White puts it, objections are a philosopher's love language. So inquiry is central to Jessie's book's overall project because part of what Jessie wanted to do is to develop an account of the norms to which salience structures are subject. And Jessie's view of inquiry plays a really crucial role in this normative project because she thinks a key role of salient structures is the role of directing and structuring inquiry. So, on her view, roughly, to know what a good salience structure looks like, we need to know what good inquiry looks like. And so in the book, Jessie defends something like the following triad of theses about inquiry. Thesis 1, salience norm. Epistemically speaking, salient structures ought to promote the salience of more epistemically valuable inquiries and suppress the salience of less epistemically valuable inquiries. The second thesis is a thesis I'm calling outcomes matter. So outcomes matter says inquiries are epistemically valuable just to the extent that their outcomes are non-derivatively epistemically valuable. And thesis 3, I'm calling value. Value says that non-derivatively epistemically valuable outcomes are outcomes which resolve uncertainty by allowing us to precify our location in logical space. So I'm pretty sympathetic to the first of these theses. I'm unsympathetic both to thesis 2 and thesis 3. And so in these comments, I'll say a bit about why I'm unsympathetic to both. So I'll start off by talking about why I'm unsympathetic to thesis 3. So thesis 3, as a reminder, says that non-derivatively epistemically valuable outcomes are outcomes which resolve uncertainty by allowing us to precisify our location in logical space. Okay, so Jessie, I think, quite reasonably, takes it to be a desideratum on an adequate account of epistemic value that it can solve what we might call the triviality problem. So what is the triviality problem? Well, most people think that some doxastic states are more valuable than others. For example, many people will want to say that the state of knowing that P has more epistemic value than the state of merely truly believing that P. Even more people will want to say that the state of truly believing that P has more epistemic value than the state of falsely believing that P, and so on. So intuitions like these push people to endorse theses like the following: the knowledge thesis, which says the state of knowing that P has epistemic value. The more you know, the more epistemic value you realize. Or truth, which says the state of truly believing that P has epistemic value. The more true beliefs you have, the more epistemic value you realize. But such views of epistemic value face an obvious problem, the problem of trivial truths. It seems like such views have no way of naturally accounting for the fact that intuitively the amount of epistemic value an agent realizes when they know that the amount of epistemic value that an agent realizes when they know that P doesn't seem insensitive to P's subject matter. So this point has been made many times in the literature. Here is Michael DePaul. This is a passage that Jessie quotes. Take your favorite example of a well-established empirical theory, a theory you believe that we know. Throw in all the evidence on the basis of which we accept that theory. Depending on what theory you selected, this will likely add up to a substantial number of beliefs. Now, compare this set of beliefs with an equal number of beliefs about relatively simple arithmetic sums and about assorted elements of one stream of consciousness. I suspect that most of us would want to say that the first set of beliefs is better, epistemically better, than the second set. The two sets contain the same number of true beliefs. So we can call this the weak version of the triviality problem. The weak version of the triviality problem says, look, it seems like knowledge that I can know that P and you can know that Q, and my knowledge that P might, in virtue of its subject matter, realize a lot more epistemic value than your knowledge that Q, even when we know the same number of truths. But there's also a stronger version of the triviality problem. So some philosophers suggest not only that the subject matter of one's knowledge affects how much value one's knowledge realizes, but further that some knowledge realizes no epistemic value at all. Benjamin Keiser, for example, suggests that some knowledge realizes no epistemic value by drawing on a case we can call magazine. So here is magazine. You are waiting for an appointment with your physician, and in order to kill time, you grab a celebrity magazine that is offered in the waiting room. The magazine contains a voyeuristic report about the skin problems of Stella Starlet, a B-list celebrity you haven't heard of before and will likely never hear of again. The report and the accompanying pictures in the magazine provide you with excellent evidence for believing that Starlet has blemished skin, evidence that constitutes sufficient epistemic reason and thus epistemic justification for having the belief. So Keiser argues that coming to know or believe truths about Stella Starlet needn't realize any epistemic value. It seems, he writes, that there need not be any epistemic value in having epistemically supported beliefs where those beliefs are in trivial, banal subject matters. Let's call this view nihilism. Nihilism says for some values of P, no doxastic attitude towards P realizes any epistemic value. So how does nihilism bear on Jessie's thesis 3. So thesis 3, recall, says that non-derivatively epistemically valuable outcomes are outcomes which resolve uncertainty by allowing us to precify our location in logical space. So I take it that thesis 3 is incompatible with nihilism. Seems on the face of it that someone who comes to know that Stella has acne resolves uncertainty about their position in logical space. They're able to rule out the possibility that Stella does not have acne. So Jessie's thesis 3 then predicts that coming to know that Stella has acne will realize epistemic value. But this is hard to square with nihilism. So I think there are two ways Jessie might respond here. The first option is to deny that learning that Stella has acne needs to resolve uncertainty about our position in logical space. So one might say, look, failing to know that P is not sufficient for being uncertain about P. To be uncertain about P, you must have entertained the question of whether P. So learning that Stella has acne, that's only going to resolve uncertainty and hence have epistemic value for someone who has at some point wondered about whether Stella has acne. I don't think this is a viable response for two reasons. So the first reason is that such a restrictive account of what it is to realize what it is to reduce uncertainty would, I think, make predictions which would be unwelcome to Jessie. So suppose that Cameron has never wondered whether black holes exist. I take it that Jessie would want to say that if Cameron comes to know that black holes exist, that knowledge realizes epistemic value. But that suggests that learning that P must be able to resolve uncertainty even for agents who have never actively considered whether P. The second reason that I don't think this response is really going to work is that I think those tempted by nihilism will also be tempted by a closely related thesis. The thesis that learning whether Stella has acne fails to realize epistemic value regardless of whether or not the learner has ever actively wondered about Stella's skin. Okay, so how serious a problem is this? I suspect that Jessie will simply want to deny nihilism, and that's totally fair. I can feel the pull of nihilism, but I can also very easily get into a headspace where I feel the pull of its denial. You know, maybe the belief, the knowledge about Stella Starlet realizes epistemic value, but only a teeny tiny amount of epistemic value. The more worrying for Jessie, I think, is the challenge posed by the weak triviality problem. Whilst the book gives no suggestion at all that Jessie takes her thesis 3 to be compatible with nihilism, the book very much does give the impression that Jessie takes thesis 3 to accommodate the intuition that a doxastic attitude's epistemic value depends on its subject matter. This is presented as a kind of key selling point of the proposal. For example, Jessie writes, enumerating blades of grass or locating individual freckles on the nose of your beloved don't significantly resolve uncertainty about your location in logical space. They are more liable to be criticized as projects of inquiry on epistemic grounds, at least, than one that aims to identify central principles of physics. For instance, these principles both exclude larger areas of possible space in their own right and are likely to be generative of further knowledge, which will do likewise. So I find these claims puzzling for two reasons. The first reason is that I'm a bit unclear on why we're supposed to accept the following claim, that learning that there are n blades of grass in Harvard Yard excludes less logical space than learning the second law of thermodynamics. I mean, presumably there are infinitely many logically possible worlds in which it is false that there are n blades of grass in Harvard Yard, and there are infinitely many logical possible worlds in which the second law of thermodynamics is false. So, at least given the most natural way of measuring the size of regions of logical space, it's going to come out as false that there's any contrast between how much logical space these two episodes of learning is going to let us rule out. Learning trivial truths and learning laws both let us rule out sets of worlds with the same cardinality. So I think we rule out more logical space in one case than in the other. Now, of course, there might be ways of measuring regions of logical space which don't tie the size of a region to cardinality. But Jessie doesn't actually specify any such alternative theory of measurement. And so the idea that there's this contrast between learning that there are end blades of grass in Harvard Yard and learning that the second law of thermodynamics is true, it feels a bit unmotivated. What is the alternative way of measuring the size of regions of logical space that gets us this result? There's a second problem, I think, for Jessie's account of epistemic value, which is that she ties reducing uncertainty to ruling out areas of logical space. My worry is that sometimes we don't know what the laws of logic are. For example, I might be unsure whether classical logic is correct. Suppose that, in fact, classical logic is correct, and that after taking a course in the philosophy of logic, I come to know that classical logic is correct. Intuitively, my knowledge of the laws of logic realizes epistemic value. But Jessie's theory can't, on the face of it, account for this, because coming to learn the true laws of logic does not allow me to precessify my position in logical space. It doesn't allow me to rule out any logically possible worlds. Okay, so that's me as far as thesis 3 goes. I'm now going to turn my attention to thesis 2. So thesis 2, just to remind you, is the thesis that inquiries are epistemically valuable just to the extent that their outcomes are non-derivatively epistemically valuable. So in the book, Jessie is perfectly aware that lots of people are going to have concerns about her substantive account of which states are epistemically valuable. Which states are epistemically valuable is a fraught question, and lots of people are very opinionated about it. And Jessie, I think, also quite rightly points out that quite a lot of her package you can get on board with, even if you have quibbles about a lot of the details of, or some of the details of the sort of substantive account of which doxastic states are epistemically valuable. And I think that's totally right. There's a lot that one could be very sympathetic to and probably should be very sympathetic to in the sort of overall structure Jessie presents, even if, one's own preference would be to fill in some of the details a little differently. Thesis 2, the idea that inquiries are valuable epistemically just to the extent that they realize states which are non-derivatively epistemically valuable. Jessie doesn't really anticipate pushback on this to quite the same extent. And I don't think it's mysterious why. It's because this view is really very close to orthodoxy, I would say, in the epistemology of inquiry. So orthodoxy has it that the only bearers of non-derivative epistemic value are doxastic states. Now, I think that this view is false. And not only do I think it's false, I think it's exactly backwards. The view I prefer denies that any doxastic states have non-derivative epistemic value. Says instead that only the activity of inquiry has non-derivative epistemic value. So I oppose orthodoxy with heterodoxy, which says if X has non-derivative epistemic value, then X is the activity of skillful inquiry. On the heterodox view, states have epistemic value only insofar as they are either the outputs of skillful inquiry or facilitate skillful inquiry. So doxastic states can have epistemic value, but it's only ever derivative. Such a view will strike many as deeply peculiar. Inquiry is, after all, a goal-directed activity. So it might be natural to say, don't goal-directed activities always inherit their value from the value of their goals? The answer is no, they don't. Consider playing tennis. I think it's valuable to play tennis skillfully. appropriate to admire people who play tennis skillfully. But that is not because playing tennis skillfully realizes some valuable goal. Playing tennis skillfully would still be valuable if it didn't help you to stay fit or win prizes. Playing tennis skillfully is valuable primarily because to play tennis skillfully is to manifest human excellence. It's true, of course, that people who play tennis skillfully typically want to win at tennis. The goal of winning at tennis is typically only worth adopting because it facilitates the skillful playing of tennis. It is, to use Tina Wan's neat formulation, an and that we adopt for the sake of the means. I think inquiry has a similar structure to tennis. People who skillfully inquire typically care about acquiring knowledge or truth or accurate credences or understanding. But the reason is it is good to care about these things from an epistemic perspective is not because those states have non-derivative epistemic value. They may, of course, have prudential value of various kinds. They are epistemic ands that we adopt for the sake of the epistemic means. Caring about knowledge is good because most people need to care about knowledge in order to become skillful inquirers. And to be a skillful inquirer is to manifest human excellence. To flourish, cognitively speaking, is to inquire skillfully. It's worth noting that the view that inquiry or skillful inquiry is the only thing with non-derivative epistemic value provides an incredibly neat solution to the triviality problem. Why shouldn't you spend your time counting blades of grass? Well, that's not a very skillful form of inquiry. Counting freckles on someone's nose as well, not a very skillful inquiry. So I think attempts to solve the triviality problem that try to identify some kind of qualitative difference between the outputs of grass-focused inquiry and laws of thermodynamics-focused inquiry, I think these are get things completely back to front. I don't think there's any adequate way of understanding why it's epistemically more valuable to have beliefs about blades of grass than about the laws of thermodynamics that isn't a backwards looking story that doesn't look at the sort of level of skill that is required of inquirers to come to acquire those beliefs. So I think the triviality problem is a genuine problem. I think it requires a backward-looking solution, not a solution that looks at the qualitative features of belief or knowledge. Okay, that's one reason for liking the heterodox view is it offers, or at least kind of promises, a nice solution to the triviality problem, which is an extremely intractable problem in epistemology if you adopt a kind of standard teleological picture. Here's another argument for the heterodox view. Suppose you were to find yourself suddenly transported to a state at the end of inquiry. In this state, all truths are already known and perfect understanding has already been achieved. Any question you might ponder, you find that you already know the answer to it. There are no questions towards which curiosity may be fittingly directed. In Jessie's terms, you find that you've become the big knower. Okay. So if I had the option of taking a pill that would transport me to the end of inquiry or taking a pill which would transform me into the big knower, would I take it? Absolutely not. Why not? I feel very strongly that the life I would lead, conditional on taking the pill, would not be a good life, epistemically speaking. Epistemically speaking, the life I would live at the end of inquiry would be desolate, empty, and meaningless. And this is a real problem for the view that only doxastic states have non-derivative epistemic value. Because the following principle is pretty plausible. Lives which realize more non-derivative epistemic value are better epistemic lives than those which realize less. But if that principle is true, and the epistemic life I would live upon being transported to the end of inquiry is less good, epistemically speaking, as a life than the life I in fact lead, then my actual life must realize more non-derivative epistemic value than my post-transportation life. How could this be? Such a verdict is clearly incompatible with the orthodox view that only doxastic states have non-derivative epistemic value. On any plausible view of which doxastic states are valuable, my post-transportation life would realize strictly more epistemically valuable states than my actual life will. There's loads of stuff I don't know and don't understand and have horribly inaccurate credences about. But the verdict that my actual life is better, epistemically speaking, than my transportation life would be, it's perfectly compatible and indeed well explained by the view that skillful inquiry has non-derivative epistemic value. Skillful inquiry is something I do in my actual life, but which would be impossible in my post-transportation life. The big knower cannot skillfully inquire. So we have at least some motivation for the heterodox view. It better accommodates a powerful intuition about what the epistemic good life looks like, and it offers a more promising solution to the triviality problem than orthodox views. Okay, so at this point, you might object that my arguments cannot vindicate full heterodoxy, the view on which only activities have non-derivative epistemic value. You might think, okay, at best, this argument or these arguments you've given, Rachel, at best, they motivate a kind of mixed position, a position on which both states and activities can have non-derivative epistemic value. And that's perfectly true. I don't have the time here to argue for why heterodoxy is superior to a mixed view, though I think it is superior to a mixed view. In the present context, I don't need to defend full heterodoxy. In the present context, my project is to put pressure on Jessie's second thesis. And Jessie's second thesis says that inquiries are epistemically valuable just to the extent that their outcomes are non-derivatively epistemically valuable. And that's incompatible with a mixed position as well as with full heterodoxy. So a mixed position has to allow that two inquiries might differ in their overall epistemic value, even if they produce the same. So even when the transportation argument is interpreted very conservatively, it's still going to put pressure on Jessie's second thesis. Okay, that's me. Thank you so much, everyone.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Rachel. Jessie, back to you.
Okay, Brill. Thank you very much, Rachel. So I think that in Rachel's comments, she's raising two core questions for me. The first is reduction of uncertainty the right goal state for inquiry? And the second is, does inquiry even have or need a goal state of this kind, contrary to the heterodox view that she has outlined? So I'm going to say most in response to this first one. I will say a little bit about the second one, but also to the extent that I can establish that my account can deal with the triviality problem, then perhaps that takes away some of the motivation for the heterodox view. So Rachel raises two challenges to the claim that the resolution of uncertainty is the right goal state. So my claim is that inquiry is valuable insofar as it leads to the resolution of uncertainty via the resolution of our location in logical space, broadly. And Rachel raises the triviality worry, and she raises a worry about our knowledge of laws of logic. And I'm going to deal with those in the opposite order. So I'll start with laws of logic, I think, and then I'll say something about the triviality problem. Yes. Okay, so how can learning a law of logic realize epistemic value? So I'm borrowing resources from a kind of Stalnerian framework here, but I'm going to say that I don't precisify my position in logical space. So sorry, Rachel's worry is I don't precisify my position in logical space because I don't rule out any logical possible world by coming to learn these laws. But I want to say that when we learn a logical truth, we learn something about our location in logical space, that logical necessities can eliminate epistemic uncertainty, even as they don't eliminate logical possibility, and so they can be epistemically valuable in that way. I want to spend a bit more time on this triviality worry. So Rachel anticipated correctly that I might just want to reject nihilism. So nihilism was the claim that there are certain propositions that if you come to learn them, you don't gain any epistemic value at all. So I don't think that's true. I think that you do learn something of minor value when you learn about Stella's acne. If the big knower knows that, that's good enough for me, and it's something that I want to know too. I think that learning something new always has some degree of value, but it might be very, very tiny. However, I do want to make room for hierarchy of epistemic value within beliefs and knowledge. I think that's really important. And so, can I establish that I've done that? How do we make room for that hierarchy of epistemic value? So, Rachel's worry, I think, is that, well, part of my motivation for going down this route is I want to avoid views on which you might think that you quantify the value, your epistemic value, by just kind of counting pieces of knowledge or individual beliefs. And so I think there's big problems when we think about it just in terms of those kinds of cardinality of belief sets, that just because you have more beliefs, if you've individuated them very finely in very boring ways, it doesn't seem like you've got more epistemic value there. But Rachel's worry is that I've just substituted that really with a kind of cardinality of possible worlds in a way that doesn't get me the results I want in terms of being able to distinguish between trivial and less value belief states and those of greater value. So I think I need to do this not by conceiving of resolution of uncertainty just in terms of the cardinality of worlds excluded, but in terms of the kinds of structure that is then imposed on the entire space of possible phenomenon. So when I learn that my beloved has 29 freckles on her nose, I learn one individual piece of information. But when I learn that all cats of this type have 29 freckles on their nose, then I want to say that I've gained something that's more epistemically valuable. So how do I say that? So the way I'm thinking about it, when you learn a law of any kind, be it thermodynamics or to do with cats, then you reduce dimensions of freedom within a model. And so in doing so, you reduce uncertainty at a kind of higher dimensional level. So if you have a look at my little graphs over here, suppose we've got a kind of 2D possibility space, we've got pressure and we've got temperature, and each of those could have 100 different values. We don't know what the temperature is. It could be any of 1 to 100 different values. Now, suppose we learn that pressure is always 2 times the temperature. In some sense, we know not very much more about what the temperature is, what the pressure is. It could be any of these values. But what we do know is that once we have one of those values fixed, we're going to be in a position to fix the other one of them. And so a law restricts how states can evolve and which trajectories are possible. And so in that way, it's highly epistemically valuable because it very significantly helps us to resolve uncertainty. Okay. Does inquiry have or need a goal state? So Rachel raises the possibility that maybe inquiry is a bit like tennis, insofar as it's a kind of manifestation of human excellence, that it can seem like there are kind of goals within a game of tennis. You want to score points, but they don't really matter to the manifestation of human excellence. They're just there insofar as they kind of facilitate it doing exactly that. So I think this is an intriguing possibility, but it's not what I agree with. And I just want to give one suggestive reason of why I don't agree with it. So one question I think it raises is this. So many sports manifest human excellence equally well. They just do so in slightly different ways. So I've enjoyed very much the Winter Olympics recently, and there you have the opportunity to enjoy the manifestation of human excellence in totally different ways. You can watch your bobsled and you can watch your ski jumping, and people are doing extremely different things there. But it doesn't seem like one of those activities is intrinsically more valuable than the other because both of them manifest human excellence. Similarly, with tennis, you can play tennis, but you can also play real tennis, which is sometimes known as court tennis. You could play squash, which is also sometimes known as soft rackets, to distinguish it from hard rackets, which is also known as rackets. And all of those things seem like they can help us manifest human excellence. And that's maybe because the particular goal that they all contribute to doesn't really matter. So my question then for Rachel really is, will inquiry manifest human excellence equally well if we do it in a way that doesn't secure the same goals? And I think there's perhaps a dilemma in this area. So in a sense, I'm asking, could we have inquiry Olympics in addition to the Winter and Summer Olympics? So here's the dilemma that I think is in play here. If we say no, if we say, actually, no, in order to manifest human excellence, it needs to be an activity that produces epistemic, sort of goal states that look epistemic in some way or other, then we might feel like it's quite hard to explain why you can't have this diversity of forms of inquiry if it isn't that the value of the activity is derivative from the value of the goals. On the other hand, we might say, yes, you can have lots of different forms of inquiry. They all manifest human excellence. Then I want to know, what is it that unifies these activities as forms of inquiry? So what is the natural kind inquiry if it isn't something to do with the distinctive form of value that they realize? And maybe you're going to say, in that case, that that's what helps us identify it, but it's not intrinsic to the actual value of the activity. But yes, that I think that's one question that Rachel needs to answer. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you again to everybody for their comments and yeah, to Paul for the opportunity to do this.